Welcome to The Difference Makers, a Paladin Security podcast. We'll take you inside the world of security and share firsthand expertise from our industry professionals. Join us as we dive into everything security and explore the journeys of those who go above and beyond to make our world a safer and friendlier place.
Hello and welcome to the Paladin Difference Makers podcast. My name is James Blight. I'm a director with Paladin Security. I'm here with my longtime friend and colleague, Mark Forward. Today we are taking over the podcast. So a quick introduction for myself. I'm a director with Paladin. I've been in the company for about almost 2 years now. I've been in the industry for 25 years. 6 of that was spent on the client side, and the rest of it has been spent on the contract security side. Mainly focusing on retail, but also touching on post-secondary, commercial, office high-rise, and industrial as well. And I'll just turn it over to let my colleague and friend Mark introduce himself. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, my name's Mark Forward. I'm the Vice President of Operations here in Vancouver, and I've been in the business about the same as you, 30 years this past September, and started from a guard way back when and kind of worked my way up and never left. And my role here is really on the guard side, kind of overseeing our commercial office and retail areas in Greater Vancouver.
Awesome. Oh, I'm so glad you could join me today as we steal this podcast from the usual host. I wanted to talk plainly about a little bit about commercial security and some of the challenges that are being faced right now. And I just want to tell you a quick story, something that I noticed a couple of weeks ago. I was in an airport waiting for my flight to board, and there was a gentleman off to the side on his cell phone. From context, I could tell he was clearly some kind of business leader, probably in charge of some kind of company. He never found out what industry he was in, but he was having a very passionate phone call to say that he's anxious to have people get back in the office. He said it several times, and I guess what I'd like to talk about is, I mean, there's a lot of roadblocks to people returning to work. I think there's people feeling like working from home is what they prefer to do. There's people who think it's a right. But I'm curious, in terms of from the property manager's perspective, and from the businesses within the property, so the tenants of the property, what do we see as roadblocks to having people return to work from a security perspective?
I mean, I think from the tenant's perspective, the roadblock is kind of human nature, right? People become used to working from home. Meanwhile, our clients, the landlord, is kind of invested in their buildings and kind of made some changes throughout COVID so that they can welcome tenants more back to the office. So they're ready, willing, and able to have them back. There's a little bit of resistance on some of the tenant side, but I think that does depend on the tenant mix. So depending on if you have a law firm, for example, they will be at a higher occupancy rate currently than maybe a tech firm. So depending on the office client or depending on the mix, that can or can't be an issue. I think from a security perspective, for our staff, it's just kind of refamiliarizing themselves with the tenants in the building, because if the occupancy rates have been lower the last few years, they're not seeing the same people every day that they normally would. So it's just kind of better refamiliarizing themselves with those folks that would normally come in 5 days a week that are maybe now coming in 3 days a week or every other week or whatever the particular situation may be.
Right, that makes sense. And I would think that to do that well, we'd need to encourage our team members to really be proactive with their engagement, like going out of their way to engage with those tenant employees as they're coming through the door, say good morning, really make security sort of front and center, and proactively pushing that customer service and engagement to make them feel welcome in order to sort of build that rapport and build that familiarity. Do you agree?
Yeah, for sure. It's mainly being visible, right? Particularly in the office lobbies, kind of being out front and center, which from a service perspective makes the tenants feel comfortable, and then from a security perspective, it discourages crime and discourages some of those the elements that may be preventing those tenants or creating that mindset in some of the tenants anyways, that perhaps it's not safe downtown, or perhaps there's a number of reasons why I shouldn't go to the office when they're really not legitimate reasons. I think our staff generally, they want to be front and center. They want to provide service and they want to engage with the tenants. I had a client a couple of years ago tell me that the concierge that we had in the building in the daytime and the afternoon knew what the tenants had for breakfast, or knew what the grandkids of the tenant were doing that weekend. And that was something that the client themselves, the property manager, would have no idea of, right? So that's pretty intimate information that's being shared with our frontline security staff, and that's really the value that we can create in these buildings.
Absolutely agree. And it's interesting. I think it's safe to say that the security department in a building probably has more interactions with frontline customers and tenants than almost any other department in the building. I mean, our concierges are seeing everyone as they come through the door, and then we're maybe delivering memos or patrolling past office suites throughout the length of the shift. So I think there's a real opportunity for security to build those relationships, and that's pretty encouraging to hear. But you said something earlier that I want to double back to. You were talking about crime and criminality as it relates to being a roadblock potentially to people returning to work. And I think it's no secret that nationally, I mean, every city in Canada is essentially experiencing an increase in some less than desirable activity. I'll put it that way. We're seeing an increase in homelessness. We're seeing an increase in drug use. There's an opioid crisis, obviously, that's ongoing. We're seeing more and more open drug use. And a lot of that is taking place on the streets in front of these buildings that we protect and that are trying to welcome people back. Would you agree that some of that activity is potentially making people think twice about wanting to return to the office?
I think it's definitely a factor. In any city or municipality, I think we're seeing these things. Obviously, they're concentrated a little more. They're more dense in the downtown cores. So, there's no real way to avoid it when you come into the downtown core. But that's something that I think is largely a perception problem. All the property managers and even amongst our fellow security companies, I mean, everybody is been quite diligent sort of post-pandemic on this sort of thing and being visible, kind of doing what we can to address these issues when we see them, kind of notify the police or encourage the behavior that's unwanted to kind of leave the property. So everybody's being as proactive as they can on it, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you said something interesting again. You mentioned the word perception. If you've been working from home for the last couple of years, and then you come downtown for the first time, maybe you haven't seen or haven't been exposed to sort of some of those things we mentioned, homelessness and drug use and addiction. It's now front and center, potentially causing people some stress. And as you said, the word perception, but a perception that it's not as safe or a perception that it's not a place they want to be. And I'm thinking one of the roles security could have is potentially trying to reframe that perception for people. And I think going back to your comment about tenant engagement, that tenant engagement could help to improve the perception of safety. If when they walk into the building, they're greeted by a competent, well-dressed, strong deportment security professional saying good morning to them and potentially making them feel a little bit more secure, a little bit more at home, so to speak.
Yeah, I think the perception you're speaking earlier about that group that maybe finds things less safe now, sort of post-COVID, particularly in a downtown environment. I mean, I think that is a relatively small group. It's a bit more of a perception than reality. But our team at any property is ultimately generally the first and last that engages with the tenants when they're in the building, right? So that I think that is it's a key value that we can bring if we can sort of be visible in the lobbies and be visible in the parkades. And the parking areas sometimes are an issue as well. Now that people have become accustomed to more flexible work, maybe they come in earlier in the morning, right, when the parkades aren't as busy. There's less people around. There's underlying perception that maybe things aren't safe, and they expect to see a guard, or maybe they want to see a guard, even though really nothing has changed safety-wise from that parking in your parking stall and walking into the office building. But the reality is that the tenant feels a little less safe in that environment. So it's our job to find a way and work with our clients to find a way to reduce that perception.
100% agree with you. I think that's a great point, especially about the people moving through parkades at different times of the day than they're used to. And then again, it comes back to that perception. If they perceive that it's not safe, then they will feel like it's not safe, even if statistically it is safe. And I think that's a very valid thing for us to keep in our heads as we try to create these safe spaces for people and make the world a safer place. One thing we've talked about is the homelessness, and I know this is a bigger issue than something we can solve as a security company. It's obviously a huge social issue, and it's a provincial issue, it's a federal issue, it's a municipal issue. I'm curious. We talk a lot internally at Paladin about empathy-led security, and we've got some strong programs in place throughout the country where we practice this empathy-led approach to dealing with marginalized people, people with addiction issues, people with homeless people, etc. And I'm curious how you see that fitting into the equation here with creating the safer space in sort of a post-pandemic world. That was a big question.
It's a big question. Yeah, I think, the empathy-led security and just kind of giving more thought to how we conduct ourselves when we do our jobs is a big aspect. We do that indirectly too, kind of behind the scenes when we have control rooms and that sort of thing, where we can kind of keep an eye on from a distance of some of these issues as they develop, or kind of get an idea for how long somebody is lingering before we need to approach. And whether we even need to approach if we can watch them on CCTV and make sure they leave the property on their own. But I think our folks just have to take a little more time and take a little more thought in conducting themselves when they deal with these issues, right? You and I have been around for a while. 20 years ago, the way we would handle somebody who was falling asleep on private property would be much different than how we handle it now, right? And ultimately, what we try to do now is assess each situation, right? We can't make judgments before we arrive on a scene. We've got to kind of see, what are we dealing with? Who is it? Is it someone we're familiar with? Are they doing something that they shouldn't be doing? How do we convey that to them? What options can we give them? What resources are at our disposal? Do we need to call the police? Do we need to, again, get our kind of CCTV, our control staff keeping an eye on the situation so that we can kind of watch from a safe distance? There's a number of things at play there, but ultimately we need people that can think and react a little more than what we are used to expecting in the past, I think.
I agree with you completely. It's funny, I was going to use the same example you did about how it would have been done 20 or 25 years ago. And there'd be a lot less care, I think, given, a lot less empathy for sure in the approach. I think you were getting close to talking about it, but the other aspect that makes things challenging is mental health issues, and learning to recognize when you're approaching somebody that you need to have a chat with because they're loitering or because they're, as you said, falling asleep on a property where they shouldn't. How we can recognize common signs of mental health. If someone's having a crisis, being able to recognize that, and as you said, getting them the help they need, whether it's calling 911 to get an ambulance there so they can get the care they need to make sure they don't hurt themselves or hurt other people. I think it's a very different approach to what would have happened 25 years ago. And I think the other thing we talked about is making sure our staff have access to the resources. So making sure the employees working at a property have the lists of nearby shelters or nearby food banks or other services or social services that we could provide to the person who is homeless or in crisis, whether it's mentally or whether it's due to addiction, and getting them that information so they can find help potentially that they need, and sort of taking that extra step of humanizing it. I think that's part of what empathy led means to me, is remembering that the person you're dealing with, sure, they don't necessarily fit in the environment. They're not a tenant. They're not a usual customer. They're not there to patron of one of the services of the building. But we need to remember that they're people, and we should be treating them with respect and making sure we're doing everything we can to try to get them the help they need. I think that's a huge part of the empathy-led security concept from my perspective.
Yeah, I think it definitely. Well, first of all, it requires somebody that has empathy and wants to, use empathy, right? So this ultimately, this is the underlying challenge that we have right now, is in this labor shortage, in this labor market, where there's less people and less quality people. We're essentially needing and demanding more of them, right? We're expecting them to care about their jobs. We're expecting them to invest in time and training, and we're expecting them to make good decisions and be accountable and all these sort of things when there's less of that quality of person around, right? So that's, as you know, something that is a challenge for sure. And I think we mitigate that by in adding some extra training. We have MOAB, which is a course management of aggressive behavior. More and more often, mental health first aid and mental health awareness type courses are being required at sites. And I think we've kind of shifted some of the drills that we do at properties. Whereas, again, years ago we would do a bomb threat drill or a fire alarm drill, and we still do those. But now, okay, it's an overdose, or it's a civil unrest, or it's more of a soft. It's not a building related drill. It's more of a crisis and intervention type drill, right? And if we can do some role play on some of those with our team and sort of understand how we all work together to address some of those issues, then that's really kind of how we can best mitigate that.
Yeah, that's great. I admittedly did not know that we were doing drills like that. I think that's really exciting, and I do see the immense value in that, especially with like an overdose drill where a person's life is potentially on the line and our response needs to be good. I also agree with the thing you said earlier about those empathy being almost a soft skill. Like we can teach someone how to open a door, we can teach someone how to use a set of keys or respond to a fire panel. It's hard to teach someone empathy. It almost requires us helping them adjust their mindset to be able to sort of see things from another person's perspective. I can see it being challenging, and I agree with you. It's a certain kind of person that we're looking for, and they're harder and harder to find. I think that's absolutely true.
Well, something that came up with clients the other day was just around the fact that this scenario that we're describing, where we're dealing with more soft skills and more interactions that aren't necessarily incidents, creates an issue when we're kind of dealing with our properties, in that we're not generating as many incidents, right? So before we used to track everything by the data. Let's look at the data. How many incidents are we doing? How many arrests are we doing? Well, arrests are down, so obviously we're not as busy. Well, no, we're not arresting people because we're engaging with them and dealing with them, and we're not even necessarily generating an incident report, because it was a 2-minute interaction that led to the person walking away. That's not an eviction. That's not an arrest.
So it's improving the perception of safety on the property, because the negative incidents are reducing. But then the challenge we have is ensuring our clients understand that just because the incidents are reducing, it doesn't mean that there's no need for security. We have to find almost a different way of measuring our performance and how the impact we're having.
The point of that discussion is to say that we need to engage with our customers and have these kind of discussions, because you can't just look at the stats and go good or bad, red or green, right? Like there's a story behind the security program now, where it used to be more you could look at the stats, but now there's a story behind the stats, right? So yes, the stats are down, but are the stats down because there's less crime, or because your security provider is doing a better job?
I'd be willing to bet that this is a debate that has been going on since Robert Peel deployed the first police officer in England, like from Scotland Yard. I'm talking the beginning of the modern policing that we know. I'm sure this exact thing has been talked about, where you deploy a security program or a policing program, it has a positive impact and negative aspects reduce, which leads the people paying for it to think, well, then we don't need this anymore. So it is a really interesting challenge. And as you say, there is a story that needs to be told, because we need to find a way of, security has been historically an evidence-based profession. And an evidence-based profession where we have stats to back up everything that you're doing and stats to justify the need for security. But you're right. by definition, if a security program becomes perfect, there will be no incidents. And therefore, why do we need a security program? So finding a way of communicating to clients, customers, to people that there's more to it. Like this is evidence of the success of the program, not evidence that the program is unnecessary. But it's got to be an endless challenge. I'm certain this is something that people have talked about for hundreds of years, because as a policing or security department nears perfect efficiency, your negative incidents are going to plummet so far that you question the need for the department, and then it probably causes I could see it causing a cycle where we reduce the budget spent on safety and security, and then incidents return, and then you increase the budget and incidents come back down, and you kind of end up in this perpetual wheel.
Yeah, I think I can think of another client or two that what they've done is go sometimes patrol with our staff or work a graveyard shift with our staff, and I think that's a soft way of kind of realizing what goes on, right? And even any client could, walk for 10 minutes or 5 minutes with our supervisor or a person on site and just kind of see what they're doing. But I think when you go through an exercise like that, where you spend a shift and see what's going on, you have a greater appreciation for what's going on and what's not captured in the reports. And that when you go into a stairwell in a parkade and, what the smell is and what the the lighting is and all that sort of thing, like you have a better appreciation for what that frontline security officer is doing.
Yeah.
And it's not really captured in a report, and it does give you a better idea of what we're doing, right? Again, in this underlying environment of, can we find enough good people, and can we keep them? So yeah, the economics of this all is interesting too, right? Because we need to pay people more to get and keep better people.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, while we do that, and if we do it effectively, we could potentially be reducing incidents, or we could potentially be generating lower stats because we're not arresting people like we were 2 or 5 years ago. We're not evicting people per se. We're having discussions with people who leave the property. So that's not really even an eviction, right?
Right.
So it's interesting. And I think that, so ultimately for Paladin, it's having those relationships with your client that maybe 2 or 5 years ago you would send the monthly report. The monthly report has some narrative and some graphs and statistics, and the client would look at it and go, that's great, get some sort of understanding or meaning out of it. But really now it's more of a discussion on what is really happening. And even though numbers are down, we could be working harder, or we could be dealing with more challenges, even though the raw numbers themselves are down, right?
Right. It's a bit of a like chicken egg situation, like the stairwell example you gave, in terms of the stairwell has no one sleeping in it, therefore we don't need to patrol it, or the stairwell has no one sleeping in it because we've been patrolling it, and figuring out the cause and effect and the causality connecting those two ideas is so important. One of our clients is, at one of our client sites, our team is doing this. They're tracking every approach. So every time they walk up to someone to convey any information, whether it's you can't smoke in this area, or sir, you can't sleep here, or sorry, ma'am, you can't use rollerblades in the mall, whatever the interaction is, they're tracking the approach and then classifying it as compliant, non-compliant, or requiring police. So they end up on their monthly report showing that the security team interacted with, say, 600 people this month, and that 84% of it was compliant and 14% of it was resistant, or whatever the stats might be. But it's interesting because, as you said, traditionally, like when you and I were patrolling the ground, we were frontline guys 20-something, whatever it was, years ago, I don't think we would have written a report about that. If I walked up to someone and said, sir, you can't smoke here, and he stopped smoking, I wouldn't even write that down. Like, that stat would be irrelevant unless he refused and I had to call the police. But it's interesting to think of some different metrics we can start to track to try to tell that story and support the positive outcomes that the program has.
Yeah, it's almost a secondary category of stats, right? It's like soft stats.
Yeah.
I don't know how you...
Activities rather than incidents, perhaps. I mean, there's some incident management systems that do record things that way. A non-critical thing is an activity. It's just something that the security officer did. Whereas an incident is where, you have suspects and victims and patients or an accident scene and things you're taking pictures of. Well, I think in terms of like innovative approaches to some of these things, a big part of it's training, like Mark was saying, like making sure that we train our teams to engage with tenants and customers the way we expect them to, because it does take effort. Like Mark was saying, finding the right person to do the job. It takes effort and intention to provide proactive customer service or proactive tenant engagement. They have to go above and beyond sort of in their approach and make a real effort to engage with the tenants. But I think the payoff is so worth the effort. The perception of the security department can be made or broken by how well the security team engages with the customers, engages with tenants, engages with the client, and makes them feel like the team is competent. I was reading some studies recently about how deportment, specifically how a security professional carries themselves and how they wear their uniform, and the impact it has on other people. And it creates a massive subconscious sense of competence if your uniform is clean and pressed and worn well and you wear it with pride, you walk through your environment confidently. It makes a massive positive psychological impact on the people who are seeing you. And one study actually talked about situations where criminals have attacked security or law enforcement. And the moment they interviewed these people who'd been charged and convicted of assaulting a peace officer or assaulting a security officer, and they essentially asked them, "What made you decide to do this? What was the deciding factor that made you want to assault the person in authority?" And like 85 to 90% of the time, the answer was, well, their uniform was sloppy and they weren't carrying themselves confidently, so I figured I could fight them. Whereas they were saying if a person's uniform is pressed and they've got all the pieces on and their belt is properly equipped and they clearly take care of themselves in their uniform, they said that's not the person I want to mess with. So I really think that deportment is one thing that makes a huge positive impact, or a negative impact if it's bad, but a positive impact on a security program is how the officers are wearing their uniform with pride and making sure that everyone's uniform is up to company standards. I think it's critically important.
Yeah, and you have to tack on the smile and all that sort of stuff too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we expect them to look good and look like they can handle themselves from one side, but then we also expect that they put a smile on their face and are welcoming to the tenants and that sort of thing as well. So
absolutely. And you said looking like they can handle themselves. And I think sometimes people equate that with size, like, oh, the security guards need to be big bruisers or muscle-bound people. And that's not true. I think the competence and confidence comes from the way you carry yourself. And I think a 5-foot-tall, 100-pound security officer can be just as confident and take care of business just as well as a 6'5", 300-pound security officer if they carry themselves properly and they approach things confidently and are trained well. They know what to do, they know how to do it, and they take care of their uniform and look good in the process. I think they can achieve anything.
That's what we see more now with more international students and the male-female mix there too. We've got a lot of women that apply and that we hire as well, which obviously the average woman is smaller than the average man. So we do have a good mix there. And some of the female guards that we have at various properties, they instill confidence just by the way you watch that they know how to do the job. It doesn't matter that what their height is or whatever. So.
Well, Mark, thanks for the chat today. I really enjoyed chatting with you. Hopefully people listening to this were able to check out our chat with Dave Sulston about body-worn cameras. That should be available on YouTube if you missed it. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and thank you very much, Mark.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks very much.
This has been The Difference Makers.
Hey, thanks for tuning in with The Difference Makers. We're going to have a bunch more chats like this one and webinars around property security. So be sure to check our website in the description of this podcast episode to save your spot and catch up on previous webinars in case you missed them. Till next time.
Mark, did you like that intro voice? That was me.